Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. I have been having many dreams on how to create educational products that are interactive, handheld, don't cost too much, and explain absolutely everything. And what I realized was that when I made a 3D model that you were able to interact with, there's too many things going on. It was too fragile, it was too this, too that. Needless to say, absolutely impossible. Really needing to bring things down and simplify it. I came up with this tray, which didn't originally start as a tray, but the reason it is a tray now is because this is going to be the blueprint for the XL phone size display that you can have on your desk. You're going to be able to stack them as I come up with different models of each kind. The next one I'm going to come up with is probably motion ratio, and I'll be doing things like anti-squat, anti-dive, roll center, McPherson strut, double wishbone, multi-link, and having all of these on a display board that visually explains what is happening with that kinematic and how you are able to control it, change it, and use it to your benefit. So this is what I came up with this. Obviously, you're looking at this and you're thinking, wow, that looks awfully simple. I'm sure I could have come up with something like that. Maybe you could have, but let me tell you, the simplest ideas are oftentimes the most complex to think of. I probably have 9 of these before arriving at this final rendition, and I'm about to show you some of the things that were challenging with making something of this size. The bigger something is when it comes to 3D printing, the better the detail and the easier it is. So starting with the arrow, this is what is going to tell you which direction this board is simulating. I'm sure you guys heard that click. That click is what has been challenging to come up with, to have enough relief in the material to flex and allow the extruded extremities to grasp an internal shoulder with enough pressure that it's not going to come out, but then not so much pressure that you can't put it in. Very tricky, to be honest. The front and rear direction arrow goes in place. This is going to tell us which way we're able to look at it. So if I put the arrow this way, obviously the front of my car is here. And if I flip it, then the front is here. The reason I did that is because of the steering rack and how important it is to focus on if you have a rear rack or a front rack car, because they are literally the opposite in every way. And I'll explain that why later. The next thing was the wheels. These little wheels are quite tricky. The holes, the details, the arrow. And then when I made it all black, you couldn't really tell that it was a wheel, so outlining it with green. These also clip in with the same function as the arrow, with a slightly lighter tolerance so that they can rotate easier. I wanted the arrow to be pretty rigid, and then I wanted the wheels to be pretty free. This is literally the difference of a few thou on the software to create this difference. The wheels are still, I could drop it another thou still. I'm talking imperial here, if you don't know what a thou is. It's 1/1000th of an inch. And then these are your steering racks / tie rods. Now, of course, some of you guys are gonna say, well, a steering rack has multiple pivot points with inner tie rods to outer ball joints to steering rack, and this is just a fixed limb. But I'm here to tell you that that would have made this way too complicated, and this exactly resembles what Ackermann does at what angles, the exact same as a steering rack. So for demonstration purposes, we didn't need to have the whole steering rack simulation. It just made it way too complicated. So I made nice little holders for these. So we have our short, medium, and long. And these were tricky as well. You can kind of notice the slit I had to put in the end. This didn't originally start with a slit. It was only a cut in the little extension here. These extensions were actually breaking off as I was putting them in. The slit actually gives it that relief to flex and deform, where these tips can actually touch each other and it still comes back to shape. That took a while. You wouldn't think it would, but I'm giving you guys a lot of secrets that I wasted a lot of time on. Okay, so now that I have, this is basically how you would receive this as a product from us, which we're gonna have an educational section on our website where I'm gonna be releasing these probably once a month. They're gonna be stackable, you're gonna be able to put them on your desk, and then we also added 3 locations for magnets. I don't want these to be expensive. We have not decided if we're going to be including the magnets or not, but that means you could put it on your fridge, It means you could put it on your toolbox. It means you could set it on something metal and it's not gonna go anywhere. And we're gonna come out with one a month to the point where we're probably gonna have 10 of them. They're gonna be in a stack like this. You can make a label that goes here so that when they're in the stack, you can kind of pick and choose and pull them out. But every one of them is gonna have the description. One of the ones I wanted to make was a McPherson strut and a double wishbone, but I wanted to do a McPherson on this side and a double wishbone on this side so that you can actually see the articulation at the same time paired against each other. I have so many ideas. Let's get right into it though. Let's start systematically with rear rack cars. Probably 30 to 40% of vehicles are rear rack and then the rest are front rack. Let's start with the shortest length tie rod on a rear rack. This is the front. Let's go. We're going to install these in place and just kind of articulate it and just watch what happens. And as we notice what's happening, we're going to see different numbers appearing on the degree scale. Now, if this is the front of the car and we are drifting in this example, I have 50 degrees reading on the inside wheel. And if I'm drifting, that means the rear we're turning around a right-handed corner. So we're drifting this way. You notice that my lead wheel's at 50, my trail wheel's around 32. And when I turn the other way, the same thing happens, 50 and 32. So what's happening here is we have a positive Ackermann position. And if you notice, the shortest tie rod or steering rack length is on the inside of each wheel. So remember that when looking at your own car, if you have a rear rack, that this is the scenario that creates positive Ackermann. And I'm not going to go into what benefits positive, zero, and negative Ackermann have, but for your own information, rear rack, short tie rod, or short rack position on the knuckles is going to give you positive Ackermann, and you can see it very clearly, clear as day. Let's go to the middle length position, which is actually in line with the pivot point. If I pop this out, you can see underneath I have the circle where we're pivoting around and I have a hole directly below it. That's where we're putting our tie rod. This is essentially a zero Ackermann position, and I'm going to take my middle length, clip it in, and to clip it in I'm just giving the end a little squeeze on the slit there and it pops right in. So we're going to do the same thing. I also put this scale here so that you can turn the wheel the same amount each direction and the same amount per rack. So I can know that on a positive Ackermann setting, if I go to the edge, these are also 5mm spaced blocks. I know I'm talking imperial and metric. I'm throwing it at you, I'm sorry. There's no particular reason for that. You can match up, I'm not gonna do it, but you can match up the distance that you're traveling so that you can take a positive Ackermann position and a 0 one, turn the same amount, and you're gonna see a difference in your degree, which is gonna translate directly to your car. So here we have 0, 0, 50 on the lead, 50 on the trail, and vice versa. 50 on the lead, 50 on the trail. We have successfully accomplished zero Ackermann with the middle length tie rod, and that is exactly in line with the pivot point. On to the next one, we are going to take the longest one. So this is moving your outer tie rods closer to the rotors, closer to the wheels, closer to the outside of the car. And we are going to start seeing something quite dramatic happening on the trail wheel. So you can see our leads hitting about 40. The trail is going up to 60 plus, maybe 62. We turn the other way. We do the same amount of travel on the rack here, 62 and 40. Exact same scenario. So this is a negative Ackermann situation that we have here. For a rear rack steering car, negative Ackermann seems to be the least bindy setting that you can run. The reason for that is simple mathematics. I'm not going to go into feeling or setup or anything like that. But if I put the positive Ackermann one back in, you'll notice on the lead wheel that I am hitting 65, 70 degrees on my lead wheel here. And on the trail, I'm not even getting to 30, and it's basically stopping to turning. And we have found ourselves in a position here where the rack's not really moving, but the wheel is moving a lot. That's because we have gone into such a large angle, an obtuse angle. You have acute and obtuse if you go back to high school days. On a rear rack car, all the forces are on our lead wheel. We have created such a large angle here that this tie rod has no leverage on this wheel, and this wheel is flopping and binding. So if I'm going to simulate something for you, a steering wheel turning this rack back, I'm going to push on this tie rod, and essentially nothing is happening. I'm pushing on it quite hard. You can see the blood in my nail is changing colors. I'm pushing on it, it's in a bind. Now on a rear rack car, in drifting, binding is something that occurs all the time, especially if you're angled up heavy, left foot braking. You're gonna encourage the wheel to turn further, and your rack is no longer gonna have control over that lead wheel. This is something that commonly happens and people don't understand what's going on. You are over centering and you're in a bind. That is what this is called. This range right here is all over centering. We have a variation of 10 to 20 degrees, and the steering rack is not moving in a lateral direction. If you have any amount of deflection, if you have poly bushings on your rack, if you have a bad tie rod, if you have chassis deflection or subframe deflection or something, it's very common on a 240, for example, to have deflection in all those areas. This is gonna happen. Unless you have a good hard stop to limit this, this is what's gonna happen on your rear rack car during drifting. Let's go to the front rack scenario where this is going to show you something really interesting. So I put the short one back in. We have a positive Ackermann. Front is here. As soon as I rotate this and rotate this, you can see how I put the words and logo top and bottom so I could do this. Let's do a blank here and act like you're not still looking at it as a rear rack and present a new board. The front is now here. I have headlights, I have mirrors, my trunk's behind me. We're looking this way now. This is the front. I now have a front rack car, just like an E36, like a Supra, Soar, like a lot of Toyota drift cars, Corvettes, stuff like that. Now I'm turning the wheel and immediately it's the complete opposite. Jack, show me a comparison. It's the complete opposite. My lead wheel is now doing what the trail wheel was doing on a rear rack. So let's focus on front rack. So here we are showing negative Ackermann. This is really interesting because that wheel flop that I was talking about is actually now happening on the trailing wheel. But the thing is, with a front rack car, it's not nearly as critical because all the forces are on the lead wheel here. So this wheel flop may occur, you may see it in videos and stuff, but it really isn't going to affect much because there's only 10 to 20% of the weight of the vehicle acting on the trail. So front rack right off the bat is showing its dominance in this form. So let's go through the paces like we did with the rear, only with the front. Let's put the 0 Ackermann position one in. Again, this is in line with the pivot point. That's how we're getting 0 here. Now what you're gonna notice is the exact same thing. 60 and 60, 60 and 60. It's gonna be the same. I think you can even go around this. Oh, if the arrow wasn't here, you could actually go around this like a crankshaft on an engine because they're exactly the same. Anyways, that's confusing. 60 degrees, 60 degrees. There's not too much to talk about 0 Ackermann because the lead and the trail are doing the same thing. But what we're gonna find here is something really interesting when we go to positive Ackermann on a front rack car. On a front rack car, positive Ackermann is moving the pivot points outwards towards the rotor, towards the outside of the car. And we're gonna find out on our lead wheel, we have a bunch of positive Ackermann here. We're getting 60 degrees on the lead and we're getting 60 degrees on the lead going the other way. We're only getting 40 in the trail. Okay, and this is where you can do some really cool comparisons. We can do the same amount of travel on using our scale here and compare all of these things to the original rear rack setup. But what I want to show you guys, which is really important to the argument for front rack cars, is when I reach 60 degrees on my lead wheel, I can still slide this and come out of that. Whereas you guys noticed on the rear rack car, I was unable to push it. I can still push this and come out of that angle. And on the lead wheel where all of our weight is, we are creating an acute angle here. Jack, draw 2 lines like this. on the wheel there. We're creating an acute angle where the steering rack still has incredible control over that lead wheel, even when most of the forces are acting on that wheel. So we're never gonna lose control. A front rack car really doesn't go into bind. The only reason it would is if your trail wheel gets too much angle, or if your tie rod actually goes over top of your control arm somehow like that, and then you're gonna basically be in a bind. But that is reaching 80 to 90 degrees of steering angle. So if I were to design something like a drift kart or something like that, I would be making it with a front rack, and I would be making any kit that I'm producing also with a front rack if it is possible for those reasons. Sometimes, I know what you guys are gonna say, the market may not cater to that. There's a lot of cars that we make kits for where you're not selling massive volumes, it's not worth the investment, so on and so forth. The front rack is superior when it comes to drifting. After I'm done talking about this, I will touch on racing for a second. There are definitely some key points for racing, go-karting, things like that are definitely going to pertain to this and how this is useful for you. That is pretty much it for drifting. And you can take this rack, you can stow it away back in the board. And then the idea is that this can be dropped like that and nothing is going to come off of it. That is how I wanted to make this ergonomical, cheap, and very educational for you guys to learn, understand, and not make mistakes setting up your cars. My goal is to educate everyone for an affordable price. This is really fun also to play with, and I didn't learn anything because I knew obviously how this worked, and that's why I designed it. But you still pick up on little things that you didn't notice would be so dramatic, or you didn't think would do so much or cause so many problems while I was playing with this, especially on the computer. The computer is 0-0, meaning it's a perfect fit, it's an exact constraint, and then you find out that something is able to bind in a computer even when the joints are perfect. You start to realize how much this problem is going to actually exist in the real world, where you have so many different variables like the torque on bolts and the dimensions of cars and all these things actually having a ductility. The material is not made of solid concrete, it flexes, and things like that come into play. That is why this is so important. Okay, so we're gonna talk about grip racing for a second here. When you're dealing with road racing, grip racing, time attack, you have to consider the slip angle. Slip angle is the amount that the tire is able to withstand before slipping, given the amount of weight that is on the tire. Because of the Formula One cars and other cars that have a lot of downforce, that slip angle is massive because of the amount of weight that's on the tire. So they actually want to increase the turn-in response of the tire to compensate for the amount of weight that's on the tire. In order to do that, they have so much more weight on the outside tire. So they actually want lower or a negative Ackermann, meaning the outside tire is turning more than the inside tire. This would also be considered toe in at angle. So let's recreate that. If you remember from what I just said, guess which tie rod we need to put in place here in order to do a negative Ackermann setting with a front rack steering car. I'll wait for you to think of it yourself. It's a little test. Okay, that's enough time. We have picked the shorter tie rod. And the shorter tie rod, mind you, on the rear rack was the one that gave us positive, so on the front rack it's going to give us negative. Let's clip it in place and see what it does. And there we have it. We have increased the steering of the outside tire relative to the inside tire, and that is going to increase our, well, basically if you have a ton of downforce like they do in a Formula One car, that's going to give you more turn-in response, more grip from the tire, and that's how that works. But that does not translate to everybody. Formula One car is very rare in the sense that they make an absolute ton of downforce. In regular racing and regular driving, I would say, we actually want to be running a positive Ackermann setup because we're not running tires like they are and we're not creating a downforce like they are. And when you're racing, the purpose of Ackermann is because the width of the chassis determines the radius that these tires have to drive around. And because of that, positive Ackermann exists because the radius on the inside tire is smaller than the radius of the outside tire due to the width of the car. You'll notice on regular street cars, they are all running between 8 and 12 degrees, maybe more or less above that or below that. of Ackermann, and that is to prevent scrubbing of the tires, to make the tires last longer, and to utilize the most amount of tire without extreme conditions. So, like I said, I didn't want to go in too much of the benefits of Ackermann or why the reasons are, other than explaining how you could use this for your racing or your drifting or your go-karting or your RC cars. I will explain one effect that occurs with severe negative Ackermann, and that is something called crab walking. I'll give you my personal experience of this. During the rain in Finland, the car was crab walking quite aggressively, and that's because I'm not even gonna explain why. It just does. And I know why, but I'm gonna just tell you. In the rain, the car crab walks when the rear loses traction, and instead of the car rotating around the front, it actually just steps over. And when you're trying to run a wall within, a couple of inches, and your car is just stepping over rather than rotating, you're gonna hit the wall like every time. And everyone in Finland was hitting the wall. There was nothing you could do about it. And the one thing that really helped was giving myself a much higher positive scenario. And the car really changed, and it really began to rotate again, only during extreme wet conditions. So that is my personal experience with the benefits, because otherwise in the dry, I run 0 or very close to 0. Usually a +2 degrees difference between lead and trail. And I really never change it. I really don't. I've left it for years on the S14, on the Corvette, but only in the rain have I noticed that, man, do you ever need positive Ackermann in some cases. With all of that said, this is gonna be available for pre-order. I'm gonna just start printing these like crazy. Luckily, I have perfected the print file to the point where this comes right off of the mat, cools for a couple of seconds, and then they just all clip right in, literally ready to ship. And then we got this textured back on our base, and it actually leaves a really nice finish on the plastic. So overall, I'm really happy with how everything's gone so far, and we're gonna just keep making these for you guys, and everyone's gonna have the perfect setup, and there's not any excuses for anything. And because I made everything clip in, I should be able to throw this, yeah, it's perfect. So it's really exciting. Glad you guys had such good feedback on this, and thank you for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one, and we'll have another one of these in the next month or so.